It's my pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker. You've got bios on your table, so I'm not going to do that again, but I do want to highlight a few things. Steve Herman wears many hats. He's an educator, a journalist, and an author. And he's published a book about what it means and how you would go about, should you want to, being a White House correspondent. And the paperback version is going to be coming out shortly, so watch for that wherever you buy your books. Steve is the executive director currently of the Jordan Center for Journalism, Advocacy, and Innovation at the University of Mississippi. Prior to that, he's most famous for two of his jobs. The first was a Voice of America's senior White House correspondent, and then subsequently the White House bureau chief and chief national correspondent. So he has lots and lots of stories to tell. So ask him lots of questions tonight. He was born in Cincinnati, Ohio. He grew up in Las Vegas, Nevada. And when he met with our students tonight, he told them, which I had not realized, that he was already a journalist at the ripe old age of 17 years old. And by 18, he was getting stories published nationally. I think that's pretty darn impressive. He's got a long, distinguished biography. I won't go through all that, but just to highlight a couple things, he was one of the few journalists to spend time in Fukushima nuclear power plant when it was hot. That was in 2011. He spent a number of years in Japan and was the president of the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan there. And he's one of those journalists whose Twitter account was suspended because someone who shall remain nameless, who happens to own Twitter, decided he didn't like what Steve was saying. So you can ask him about that too. But his topic tonight is going to be Voice of America, a little bit about the history of Voice America, the important work that it did, and who's filling the void now, since there's very little left of it. So this should be a really fascinating topic. And before I invite Steve to the podium, we're going to show a very short video clip.
This is the Voice of America.
The Voice of America.
Stimme aus Amerika.
You are tuned to the Voice of America in Washington.
For more than 8 decades, this was the broadcast that many relied on in times of war, repression, or natural disaster.
This is a voice speaking from America.
The Voice of America, VOA, was established in 1942 to counter Nazi propaganda.
The people of the United States extend the hand of friendship to you across the seas.
VOA delivered accurate, objective, and comprehensive reporting in 49 languages to a weekly global audience of more than 350 million.
The news may be good or bad. We shall tell you the truth.
That changed on March 15, 2025, after President Donald Trump ordered the agency dismantled. VOA's radio and TV broadcasts went silent, and its website stopped updating. More than 1,300 journalists and other employees were put on leave. VOA's worldwide affiliates were caught off guard.
U emisiji trebalo je da govore i kolege sa Glasa Amerike, međutim Donald Trump je ukinuo finansiranje Glasa Amerike.
VOA journalists took the administration to court for violating the First Amendment and the Constitution's separation of powers. On March 28th, a federal judge temporarily halted the dismantling of VOA.
We are committed to continue this fight until we can return to our congressional mandate of telling America's story to the world through factual, balanced, and comprehensive reporting.
On April 22nd, a second federal judge called on the Trump administration to restore VOA. While the cases are undergoing appeal, VOA's worldwide audiences are left without the accurate and balanced news they've come to rely on.
Remember, in Zimbabwe, we are under a repressive regime that does not tolerate any dissenting voices, alternative voices, and as such, we had been subjected to one state-controlled broadcaster since 1980.
Amerika adalah simbol jurnalistik yang jujur dan independen yang dibutuhkan oleh dunia.
America's adversaries are poised to step into the void.
The departure of the Voice of America also leaves a gaping vacuum in the information world that can only be filled by countries like China and Russia.
For 83 years, the Voice of America has delivered independent news, including to places where press freedom doesn't exist, strengthening American soft power and national security. Please contact your representatives in Congress and tell them to save VOA.
This is the Voice of America, Washington, D.C., signing off.
While he was the senior diplomatic correspondent for VOA, he was reporting on travel. He traveled to 75 countries, reporting on combat zones, civil uprisings, and major national disasters. Steve, we're very pleased you're here tonight. Come on up to the podium.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here. Thank you, Kathy, for making this possible, and for your great leadership of everybody that's on the board. And Joyce and Steve, thank you for your hospitality. We really appreciate it, along with my wife, Rose. We decided not to fly here from Washington, D.C. We drove, and it was well worth it, because you can see the view we had last night in Indiana. And we will get you out of here early enough tonight so that you also hopefully can see the aurora borealis. And this subject, geomagnetism and all that, I'm a ham radio guy, so I could talk about that all night, but that's not why you came here to see me this evening. And that video we just saw, and by the way, you can go look at it at savevoa.com, the grassroots movement that made that video. But I think it gives you an idea of just how dynamic the Voice of America was until this year. For those of you who may have listened to its broadcasts in decades past, it had evolved into a very different and dynamic VOA. When I began my career as a journalist back in high school, as Kathy noted, shortwave radio was still significant. Those signals beamed across borders and oceans carried more than news. They carried competing visions of truth: capitalism versus communism, democracy versus authoritarianism. And they were important weapons in a global struggle for influence. International broadcasting came to prominence in an era of rising authoritarianism. In the 1930s, as the world hurtled toward war, governments recognized radio's unprecedented ability to project narratives beyond their borders. Nazi Germany was among the first to weaponize the medium. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, saw radio as a strategic tool of conquest, not just to control Germans at home, but to influence public opinion abroad. Here in central Illinois, you could have tuned in from your living room on the radio a program called Germany Calling, hosted by figures including an American-born fascist, William Joyce, better known as Lord Ha-Ha. This was English language propaganda intended for British and American listeners, mixing half-truths with outright lies designed to sow doubt and discord. Joyce, by the way, after the war, became the last person executed for treason in Britain. In the Pacific region, Imperial Japan launched its own overseas propaganda. A collection of women, all known as Tokyo Rose, became infamous for their English-language broadcasts aimed at demoralizing Allied troops in the Pacific theater. These efforts combined entertainment, misinformation, and psychological manipulation, demonstrating early on how radio could be a potent weapon of war without firing a single shot. One of those Tokyo Roses, attempting to return to the United States after the war, was arrested. Eva Toguri Diakino was convicted but not executed. She was paroled in 1965 and subsequently pardoned by President Ford. The Soviet Union, normally allied with the West during World War II, had Radio Moscow, broadcasting to foreign audiences, highlighting ideological narratives that would later harden into the battle lines of the Cold War. For democratic nations, too, the microphone also became a weapon. The BBC World Service, already broadcasting internationally by the 1930s, committed itself to credible reporting even during wartime, building a reputation for reliability that outlived the conflict itself. Franklin Roosevelt's administration, recognizing the same strategic value, created the Voice of America in 1942. VOA's mission was explicit: tell America's story, a commitment to transparency that would become a hallmark of its credibility. VOA's first broadcast was in German, promising listeners, whether the news is good or bad, we shall tell you the truth. If World War II was the dawn of international broadcasting as a strategic instrument, the Cold War was its golden age. The Iron Curtain was not just a geopolitical divide, it was an information barrier. Behind it, the Soviet Union and its satellite states flooded the ether with ideological messaging. Radio Moscow became the flagship of Soviet soft power, broadcasting in dozens of languages and portraying communism as the inevitable future. Satellite stations such as Radio Prague, Radio Tirana, and Radio Budapest amplified Marxist-Leninist ideology, often portraying Western democracies as decadent, racist, or imperialist. In the United States, in the early days of the Cold War, the Voice of America expanded dramatically, not just reporting on U.S. politics, but airing uncensored news and analysis that Soviet citizens could not hear at home. Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, funded by the U.S. government, yes, the rumor is true, originally by the Central Intelligence Agency, but staffed by émigrés and independent journalists. It penetrated the Iron Curtain with uncensored news, literature, and debate. Moscow responded with an enormous counter-effort. It jammed Western signals, building massive transmitter arrays to try to block those living in the Soviet Union from hearing VOA, RFE, and Radio Liberty. But the truth, especially when credible and consistent, has a way of leaking through. In places like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, people huddled around shortwave radios and heard reality. Dissidents like Václav Havel and Alexander Solzhenitsyn would later testify to the powers of those broadcasts in sustaining resistance and inspiring change. And I would note in the front here we have with us tonight someone who knows that history better than probably anybody in this room, Jeffrey Trimble, a former acting president of RFERL. And Jeffrey is a Russian speaker and was based in Moscow for 5 years for U.S. News and World Report and witnessed the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And when the wall did come down in 1989, many assumed the battle for global influence through broadcasting was over. Liberal democracy seemed ascendant. Budgets for international media were cut. Shortwave transmitters were shut down and antenna towers cut down. Some wondered if services like VOA, RFERL, and Deutsche Welle had outlived their usefulness. During my years at VOA, and this was not a popular suggestion, I advocated for maintaining shortwave radio capabilities, even if the audience numbers were drastically shrinking. When crises occur, battery-operated radios might be the only means of receiving information. Nowadays, perhaps the most ambitious international broadcaster currently is China. What began as Radio Peking, now known later as China Radio International, has grown into a vast multimedia ecosystem. Its television arm, CCTV, now CGTN, broadcasts in multiple languages, blending news, culture, and entertainment. but its mission is unchanged: to shape global perceptions of China's policy and governance models. CGTN recruits fluent English-speaking news anchors and correspondents, and it pays, like others, like the Russians, RT, well into the six figures for some of its staff in U.S. newsrooms. Research indicates that at least half of the budget for Chinese government-supervised media enterprises comes from the state. Besides English, CGTN is broadcasting in Arabic, French, Russian, and Spanish. The annual budget is certainly well into the hundreds of millions of dollars, and some analysts I've spoken with recently assert that it is now close to or exceeds $1 billion. Let's not forget about the Russians. Obviously, they are still someone we have to pay attention to, especially in regards to what's been happening in Ukraine. If you watch CGTN or RT, they are slick. They have hired, as I said, talented people, from on-air anchors to technical directors, to present what looks like a first-rate product, at least in terms of appearance. And yes, you can see a lot of real news from around the world on these channels. But what I caution viewers in the West is to understand the acts of omission, the stories you will never see about the repression of the Tibetan and Uyghur minorities in China, the mass killing of Ukrainian citizens by Russian forces, and so on. You might ask, in a world of TikTok, podcasts, and citizen journalism, why does any of this matter? Who still listens to the radio or watches satellite TV? Who still cares about government-funded news broadcasts? Well, hundreds of millions of people still do. And more importantly, in many parts of the world, these transmissions are the only sources of information people can access. For people living under authoritarian regimes where news is censored, journalists are jailed, and the internet is firewalled, international broadcasting from the democracies remains a lifeline. And in this fight, credibility is still our greatest weapon. State-funded media, when it is transparent, editorially independent, and rooted in fact, serves as a bulwark against manipulation. It reminds the world that democracy is not about perfection, it's about openness, accountability, and truth-telling. In the face of continuing authoritarianism from Moscow, Beijing, Pyongyang, and Tehran, we could not afford to retreat from the information space. But, unfortunately, we have. Kari Lake, an Arizona TV newscaster and election denier who twice failed to win statewide office, whose leadership of the U.S. Agency for Global Media skirts a congressional confirmation process, no longer speaks of reform, rather telling lawmakers and sympathetic right-wing program hosts that the Voice of America became unsalvageable rot. And she alleges, without a shred of evidence, that VOA's newsrooms were riddled with spies and that my Chinese colleagues were directed by Beijing's embassy in Washington. That begs the obvious question. Why did China's communist government cheer VOA's demise this year if it was supposedly calling the shots? And these actions point to a potentially highly troubling trend. Many observers and press freedom advocates view the administration's actions against these government-funded broadcasters, obviously easy targets for budget cutting, as an opening salvo in a broader campaign against independent journalism, the press, and undercutting First Amendment norms in practice. If we were to compel our own information outlets to conform to the ideology of whatever political party is in power, then we reduce ourselves to the type of closed societies we sought to open for so many decades by giving them glimpses into our own open, pluralistic, and sometimes contentious system. In recent months, the White House has sought to sideline the traditional news organizations in the press pooling system and replace some with bloggers and partisan reporters who ask the president leading or softball questions. The Associated Press was sidelined because the wire service, which follows international naming protocols, would not bow to the demands of the White House to refer to the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America. The replacements in the White House press corps seem to have become props for the president's appearances, and any traditional journalism has been severely minimized. This has become so frequent and obvious that when a Washington Post reporter called me to ask for my tape as a former White House correspondent, I replied that we had seen such a trend begin in the first Trump administration. I covered all of the first Trump administration and the first year of the Biden administration at the White House. But in the second Trump administration, tradition and protocol, which included a mutually respectful relationship between press pool reporters and the president, is gone. And I now question the utility of the whole system under this present environment. I had a unique role at the White House during the first Trump administration and the first year of the Biden administration. I was a journalist in the employ of the federal government, but legally shielded from interference or retaliation by officials, including the president, even if they did not like what I reported. The firewall protecting the voice of America mandates that. It's a law. And VOA's charter, also a law, compels its journalists to be nonpartisan and reflect significant American thought and institution in the reporting. As we know, laws are not always equally enforced. And in the last year of the first Trump administration, political appointees tried to break through that firewall, not caring about the VOA charter that mandates balance. You saw in the video briefly Patsy Widakuswara, my successor as White House bureau chief. She and I became targets of the political appointees near the end of the first Trump administration because we defended VOA's legally mandated charter and firewall. She's not here tonight because she's actually speaking about this subject at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. right now. So I'm sort of competing with her in different states. Well, I became a target again in mid-February of this year. At the time, I was the chief national correspondent of VOA, and this occurred when a high-ranking Trump administration official on social media said I had committed an act tantamount to treason. My offending action? A social media post that merely quoted an NGO executive who warned that the cuts to the U.S. Agency of International Development could endanger national security. Patsy was in the crosshairs again after she asked a question about Gaza to the Irish Prime Minister visiting the Oval Office. The president cut her off, asked Patsy, with whom he had interacted for years, who she was with, a question he frequently asked female correspondents, especially minorities. And when Patsy replied, "The voice of America, sir," he made a dismissive gesture with his hand and scoffed, "No wonder." Days later, nearly everyone at VOA was put on administrative leave by a team from DOGE, Elon Musk's so-called Department of Government Efficiency, and VOA broadcasts on air continually since 1942 were silenced, not by our adversaries, but by the United States government. Kari Lake and DOGE silenced the voice of America in 4 dozen languages, cutting off 360 million people outside the United States from VOA's valuable news and information. In West Africa, some listeners and viewers, alarmed by VOA's programming being replaced by music or static, desperately tried to reach some of our correspondents in the region, asking if there had been a coup in the United States. Proponents of VOA and its affiliates are fighting back in court. The government has also stopped dispersing the congressionally allocated funds for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Asia, and the Arabic language Middle East broadcasting networks, all of which are grantees. Radio Free Asia, starved of money, went silent this month. You have no doubt seen what has happened or is happening with the demise of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the shakedowns or voluntary donations made by network owners to the presidential library of Donald Trump or the White House ballroom, the lawsuits by the president against the New York Times, and I could go on. Free speech groups such as FIRE, which has some conservative and libertarian benefactors, publicly condemned the FCC chairman's threats to yank ABC's license over Jimmy Kimmel's remarks, underscoring the constitutional red line when regulators target speech. The chairman of the FCC, Brendan Carr, told the network, "We can do this the easy way or the hard way." The rhetoric offended even stalwart conservatives such as Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, who said Carr's comment was, quote, right out of a mafioso going into a bar saying, "Nice bar you have here, it'd be a shame if something happened to it." Recently, I moderated an appearance for FCC Commissioner Ana Gomez at the University of Mississippi, a stop on her national First Amendment tour. Gomez, the lone Democrat on the commission, said, "It is in moments like these when it is important to understand that the FCC does not have the authority, the ability, or the constitutional right to police lawful content or to punish broadcasters for speech the government dislikes. And if we were to take that unprecedented step, it would run headlong into the First Amendment and fail in court." End of quote. I would like to add to that the chilling effect. It does not require actual license revocation. The mere threat prompts risk-averse corporations to self-censor, pull programming, or temper their coverage. The escalating campaigns of lawsuits, settlements, regulatory threats, and public denunciations against the press is not merely political theater. It's a textbook case of state intimidation designed to chill speech and reshape journalism's role in our democracy. When a sitting president brags about forcing major networks to pay tens of millions of dollars in defamation settlements, sues newspapers for billions, and now he wants to sue the BBC, even in England, for $1 billion, and publicly muses about stripping broadcasters of their licenses, he is sending a clear message. Criticize me, and it will cost you. This pattern mirrors the authoritarian drift seen recently in several other democracies. In Poland, the Law and Justice Party, when it was in power, tightened control over public broadcasters, turned state advertising into a tool to reward friendly outlets and bankrupt critical ones, and unleashed defamation lawsuits against journalists. In Hungary, Viktor Orban's government packed media regulators with loyalists, engineered ownership takeovers of independent outlets, and blurred the line between public information and party propaganda. Kerry Lake, just recently, 2 days before Orban was hosted by the White House, by Donald Trump, took credit for permanently shutting down the Hungarian language service of Radio Free Europe, because it was allegedly critical of Orban's authoritarian-leaning government. In India, Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government has used tax rates, terrorism charges, and advertising boycotts to pressure critical newsrooms while state-aligned conglomerates acquire formerly independent media brands. The tactics differ in detail, but the underlying playbook is the same. Combine economic pressure, legal harassment, regulatory intimidation, and ownership manipulation to shift media from a watchdog role to a compliant mouthpiece. Each action, taken individually, can be defended as lawful, but together they erode the structural independence on which a free press depends. The lesson from Warsaw, Budapest, and New Delhi is clear. The slide from free press to managed press does not happen overnight. It happens one lawsuit, one license threat, one merger or network sale, one silenced critic at a time. The Department of Defense, or War, recently attempted to require journalists to pledge that they will not publish unauthorized information or secret documents or lose their Pentagon press passes and access to any U.S. military facility worldwide. Most of the reporters at the Pentagon handed in their access badges and walked out. Bravo. Internationally, such a policy signals to authoritarian regimes that it is acceptable to police press content under the banner of national security. Domestically, it would undermine public trust in the media if reporters are perceived as operating under Pentagon-approved terms. Their independence and credibility would suffer. I recently flew to Tokyo to deliver an address at the celebration for the 80th anniversary of the Pacific Stars and Stripes newspaper. Although paid for by the Department of Defense, the newspaper operates freely of government censorship. Hopefully, Stars and Stripes will not suffer the same fate as the Voice of America. The First Amendment is not just a legal clause, it is the operating system of a free society. It guarantees freedom of speech, press, religion, assembly, petition, and they are the mechanisms by which citizens keep power in check, that ideas flourish, and the nation evolves. Undermine them, and everything built on top becomes vulnerable. For decades, U.S. advocacy for free expression was a pillar of our soft power. If America undermines that principle at home, it loses moral authority abroad. Authoritarian governments eager to justify their own crackdowns will point to U.S. hypocrisy, and dissidents worldwide will have fewer allies. In the case of the Voice of America, Chinese and Russian state broadcasters are already moving to fill the airtime on VOA's affiliate TV and radio broadcasters around the world and on its shortwave radio frequencies. As someone who has reported from dozens of countries, many of them where reporters are not free to question leaders, I deeply cherish my daily opportunities for years to be able to directly question the leader of our country in the free world, regardless of which political party he represented. Some have drawn a direct line between the president taking umbrage with a question my successor as VOA's White House bureau chief asked, and days later, VOA going silent, with that president bluntly stating on social media about the Voice of America, shut it down. I hope I am wrong in concluding that VOA was the canary in the coal mine. Regardless of whether you are on the left, right, center, or disenchanted with the political process, I hope you will leave here agreeing on this. If speech can be suppressed, whether that is conservative speech, liberal speech, libertarian speech, the American people cannot challenge tyranny or correct injustice. What's at stake ultimately is not just a legal right, it is the American experiment itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. That was very informative, but also very sobering. And I'm sure I've got a ton of questions that I want to ask, but that's not my job tonight. So I will open the floor and start out. There's a question right here, Rochelle.
Do I think it's possible to get the Voice of America back, and how long it will take? There are a couple other people in the room might have a better answer to that than I do. I'm frankly pessimistic. The people who tuned in the day after VOA went silent, radio, TV, maybe they kept tuning back in a day or two, but those audiences are long gone now. How do we get them back? How do we even get the word out of hundreds of VOA personnel who have been on paid administrative leave for months, obviously not getting paid since the government shutdown. Others, contractors, were fired. It's not so easy, say, to get someone who broadcasts in Burmese, right? They're not around in every town. Maybe we can get experienced Mandarin correspondents back. But you also have to question is, would they want to come back after what they've been through, what they've been subjected to this year? Would they come back? Kerry Lake decided that some of our most valuable reporters and anchors who were here in the United States on J-1 visas, that they were security threats and wanted to ship them back within 30 days. Some of them would have gone back or will go back to countries where, at the very best, they would immediately be put in jail. So, unfortunately, I'm pessimistic. I have hope, but, members of Congress, if this comes back up 3-4 years from now, will they have an appetite? Will they say, oh, it's gone, we've got other things to spend money on? We've got, I think at this hour, the House is, they just voted, okay. So if it's a continuing resolution, that money for the Voice of America is still there. Congress has mandated the spending of this money, and that's why we've been in court saying this is executive overreach to shut this down. And as I was discussing earlier with Joyce and Steve, this is going to end up at the Supreme Court in one form or another. It may not be these particular cases, but this question about executive overreach, and it's not only VOA, obviously. I talked about USAID, and there's, dozens and dozens of others. And for people in the United States, VOA may be one of the least significant, because the Voice of America does not have a domestic constituency, right? It's by law, it's an external broadcasting service. But I always say, when I speak to audiences, you are the stakeholders in the Voice of America. For the price of a couple of fighter jets, for decades, VOA and the other U.S. international broadcasters were our most effective projection of soft power. They were the hard edge of soft power, our most famous brand of public diplomacy, and we have killed it off ourselves. Yeah, you're asking how Americans could be able to view it? Well, technically you can. There was a law that prohibited dissemination of the content to American citizens and the United States, but when the internet came up, that became sort of a moot question, and you can go voanews.com. In fact, the website's still frozen at March 15th. But all of the content was accessible through the website or shortwave radio or satellite transponders. It's just not intended for you. And I also believe that VOA's mission should not be to broadcast to Americans. It had a very unique mission. And I think a lot of people, when they passed the Smith-Mundt Act in the early 1950s, the decision was, we don't want the government in the business of broadcasting to our own citizens. This is purely an external service. So I don't, maybe others disagree, but I don't think the government should be in the business of broadcasting to us. Yeah, what's happened to USAID and how it's connected to VOA? Well, there's no direct connection. They were basically instruments of American soft power that essentially lost all their funding because the administration decided that's no longer important. And in some cases, obviously, they were cherry picking out programs that USAID was involved in that, they contended were counter to the objectives of this particular administration, right? With VOA, what I've heard said is that if the president could not turn the Voice of America into his the voice of the Trump administration or the voice of MAGA or whatever, then what's the point? Why should we have it? And look what's happened to the State Department with all of these the huge cuts in our diplomatic presence. I mean, we are yielding the floor to our adversaries, and they are delighted with what we are doing to ourselves? Yeah, it's a great question. How were the numbers compiled for VOA? Jeff Trimble here was much more involved in the at that level. But what I can tell you is there are major firms that are utilized to gather those numbers, and you can look at the affiliate reach, and is it totally 100% accurate? Probably not, but I think it's a pretty accurate estimate. 360 million weekly listeners somehow were receiving VOA content directly via satellite television, via radio, or on affiliate stations. I was based in India for a few years, and I know that India obviously has more than 1 billion people, and some of the major TV networks in India were using in their weekly entertainment roundups VOA material. They were only interested in what was happening in Hollywood. Okay, still, it's part of American soft power. So there's a tremendous array of content out there in all these languages. Some of it's soft, like entertainment, and we had music programs. The most influential American, probably during the Cold War, was not President Eisenhower. It was a man named Willis Conover, who hosted a jazz show on The Voice of America. And I believe that the Berlin Wall did not come down because NATO tanks did not go through it, obviously. It was the sound of jazz wafting over the Berlin Wall. The communists considered jazz subversive. And you talk to, I did not live in Eastern Europe, but you talk to people from that part of the world, and these major dissidents will tell you that jazz music was not only the greatest entertainment that they had, because they couldn't go to the record store and get jazz records, it was a morale booster. There was a direct connection between that jazz movement and the dissident movements that brought down communism. You don't have to take my word for that. There are PhD theses out there that delve into this. But that shows you the tremendous power. I've always thought that VOA in recent years should have started up a rap music program. Or maybe jazz again. I like jazz. Right. So you were in Poland and listening to Voice America, hearing about 1960s, the U.S. system. Right. Yeah. Yeah, I should. Right. RFERL, the distinction there, these were called surrogate broadcasters. So RFERL, for example, as opposed to VOA, would have Bulgarians broadcasting in Bulgaria language about Bulgaria back to Bulgaria. That was different than the mission. VOA was telling America's story to the world. In more recent decades, VOA became more comprehensive about reporting on what's going on in the entire world. I was a VOA correspondent in New Delhi, India, Seoul, Tokyo, and Bangkok, and I was reporting about what was going on in those regions. Then those individual language services could report, obviously what's happening in India may not have been very interesting for the Portuguese to Africa service, right? They could choose what to broadcast. And again, great expert here, Jeff Trimble, about the nuances and the differences between RFERL and VOA over the decades. I've made a provocative argument recently that if these services are brought back in their entirety, then maybe we should sit down not only just with U.S. international broadcasting, but with the BBC and Deutsche Welle, and sort of divide up the world. That we don't need to all duplicate broadcasting in the same languages. This is such an important thing, and resources are precious. And so maybe the nuances, the differences that were understood between RFERL in Polish and VOA in Polish no longer make sense in the 21st century. It's a story, another discussion. Yeah. Jeffrey's the perfect guy to talk about this.
Yeah, hi everybody. So the term surrogate radio these services from the United States were the domestic broadcaster in countries where that broadcaster couldn't exist. So when you're referring to news about your country, were you talking about finding out about things in Poland that you couldn't get, that you could not get from your domestic media in Poland? Yeah, well, let me just share one anecdote that concerns Václav Havel. I'm sure all of you know the poet, playwright, and eventual president of Czechoslovakia and then the Czech Republic. It was Václav Havel, when Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty was zeroed out of the budget in 1994 by the Clinton administration as a payoff for the end of the Cold War, who needs it. It was Havel who invited RFERL to move from Munich, Germany, where it had been since its founding, to Prague, to the Czech Republic. And to sweeten the deal, he threw in Czechoslovakia's parliament building, which was no longer needed because there no longer was a Czechoslovakia, and gave it to us for 1 Czech crown a day, which is $12 a year. Fast forward to 2001 and the events of September 11th, I was the editorial director in charge of all editorial operations for the 28 language services of RFERL. And it was sitting in this beautiful building at the top of Wenceslas Square. Who's been to Prague? Yeah. You know Wenceslas Square, top of Wenceslas Square, big glass building. The Czechs came to us right away and said, you got to move out of this glass building because we're afraid you're going to be a terrorist target. And then started a kind of a campaign that maybe RFERL should leave the Czech Republic. So Havel really put himself out there. He made several visits to the headquarters building. He chatted with us. He made sure to have plenty of press with him. And on one of his trips, one of his stops by, he went to the newsroom and he told the following story. He said, it was the mid-1970s, which was perhaps the most hopeless time for those of us who were yearning for a free Czechoslovakia. And I got word that I was going to be arrested yet again. And before they came to get me, I sat down and I wrote a letter to the people of Czechoslovakia. I had no expectation that I was doing this for anyone other than myself. And I put it away. And I was arrested, and I was in jail. And as was always the case when you were in jail, somebody had a radio, somebody was able to get the shortwave signal, and we were listening to Radio Free Europe. And one night, when I was in the deepest depths of my despair, I heard my letter being read on Radio Free Europe. And it gave me hope as Václav Havel for my own situation, and it gave me hope for my country. And Havel wrapped it up this way. He said, and I know today, this is 2001, there's a Václav Havel in Turkmenistan, and there's a Václav Havel somewhere in Belarus, and there's a Václav Havel somewhere in Vietnam. And these people in these countries need what you are doing. And as long as you keep doing it, we're going to continue to support it. So that's just one anecdote about the impact, the effect, and the value of these broadcasts, in this case, those of RFERL, which are continuing. They are limping along. Steve mentioned it is a grantee. Some of these networks are private companies. They're 501c3s that receive a grant from Congress through the parent agency to have their operations. So they still have a little money in the bank. That's why they're not off the air yet. But as Steve mentioned, the administration is working as quickly as it can to put them out of business as well. So sorry to go long, but I thought one anecdote would be helpful to illustrate the value of what the radios do. Thank you.
Do we have time for one or two more questions?
Would you like to tell us a story about your time in the White House? Happy alluded to inside information.
Inside information. Well, I wrote a book about my time in the White House, and I did not do what is typical of White House correspondence, which is to save some inside information and then reveal it in the book so that I could make money off of it. But what I did do was write a book explaining what it's like day to day. The students earlier asked me what was the most memorable thing that you saw when you were covering the White House. And I flew more than 100 times on Air Force One. I was in the Oval Office or the Eastern, probably more than Dick Durbin has been. I don't know. But the most memorable day for me was when I was called in as a pool reporter, and we went in the Oval Office, and sitting in there was Kanye West and Jim Brown. Jim Brown is no longer with us. And Kanye West took over. He was trying to show the president something on his cell phone about some rocket fuel that he had invented. And he was slamming his hand down on the Resolute desk, the most iconic piece of American furniture. I guess it can handle it. And he was also using four-letter words, which I don't think have been uttered in front of TV cameras and microphones before in the Oval Office, but are definitely said on probably a near daily basis throughout all administrations in the Oval Office. And then Kanye West gets up, uninvited, goes around to the other side of the Resolute desk, I don't think you've ever done this, and hugs the president. And I saw this look on Donald Trump's face, the only time I saw this particular look on his face that said, maybe this was not a good idea. A typical day at the White House. Yeah, it's a great question about where I get my news from, and do any of these outlets potentially have the reach of our traditional sources of news. Look, this is something I'm working on at the Jordan Center at the University of Mississippi, because there's an innovation part in the title of the name of my journalism center. And this is something we're looking at. My hunch is pick an age group under 45, and probably very, very few people are getting what they would consider to be news from traditional sources of information. They're getting it from Instagram, TikTok, whatever the algorithm feeds them on Facebook. It's not a healthy news diet because it's not news, most of it. It's opinion, it's commentary. In some cases, it's filtered disinformation, coming in some cases from our friends in Russia. I don't think there's, I don't think we're ever going to have like a Walter Cronkite figure in American journalism again. Where do I get my news? Well, I'm in the business. I'm a career journalist, so I don't think I'm typical or that anybody would necessarily want to emulate how I get my news. But I do try to listen to and watch and read a variety of different sources. The biggies: New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post. I even look at the Drudge Report still, see what's going on over there. But I'm not in that under 45 plus demographic, so I'm not typical. I don't really watch, frankly, network newscasts anymore. I don't have time. I'm not into time shifting. I listen to NPR in the mornings. I have my critiques. I got interviewed by NPR Illinois this week. I'm very grateful for that. And I do have my critiques about NPR. One thing I think that is pretty strange that I do, at night I leave a radio on. That's my cell phone, actually. But I listen to BBC World Service all night. I fall asleep to it, wake up to it, and I have the uncanny ability when there is a major story breaking to wake up instantly, because I used to have to as part of my job. So I don't suggest emulating that. Yeah, it's Behind the White House Curtain, a senior journalist's story of covering the president, why it matters. It came out from Kent State University Press in 2024. A softback, much cheaper edition is coming out in the spring of next year with a new preface that covers some of the exciting events that have happened this year. Thank you for that plug. Senator.
I was asked to go to an interview in the LBJ room in the Capitol. And I walked into a room full of people that I'd never seen before, a crowd of them. It turned out they were influencers. And so This one young lady from Los Angeles interviewed me, and I said to her, before you started your podcast, what did you do? She said, I sang in a band. I said, which one? She said, well, for my stepfather's Tom Chapin, Harry Chapin. I said, so how did you get into this? Well, I just started talking and people started listening. I get my news similarly to you, and most of the people in the room do, I'm sure, trusted sources, but we represent about 11% of America if you go to radio, TV, and traditional sources. So where do the other folks get their news? You mentioned quite a few. I think the sharp contrast is brought out when you look at two numbers. What is the average audience of CNN in a day? About 500,000 people. Not bad. What is the average audience for Joe Rogan, the #1 podcaster in America? 11 million. 11 million. So if you were to reinvent Voice of America today, in 2025, and look at what happened when it was invented in the 1930s, when radio was new, kind of a novelty, and people were anxious to listen to it a lot. Today, where would you go to spread that same news from different media?
Thank you, Senator. It's an excellent question. I think to answer that question, I would love to have input into that, but I think we also need to have other people in the room. I've said in general, journalists cannot solve the problem of journalism in this country. We need help. We need outside help. And for the Voice of America, it was great that it was, I'll speak about it in the past tense because essentially it is in the past tense, that it was part of government bureaucracy, and you know how slow things can move in a government bureaucracy, but because it didn't have to be part of, we didn't have to care about the ratings or, advertising to fund the thing. We had a certain degree of autonomy to be a public service broadcaster, except it wasn't for the American people, it was for the rest of the world. VOA in recent years had gone to a sort of digital first model. There were probably more people consuming its content online, through streaming, through mobile apps, and I think we were pretty good at that. Certain language services, it wasn't one size fits all, so if WhatsApp was big in a particular country and Facebook was not, then it didn't waste time on Facebook. But the thing that needs to be preserved, we can talk all day long about dynamic and more provocative and accessible distribution models, but what we need to keep and what's missing now when you talk about these influencers is the journalistic model. Who, what, where, when, why, putting it in context, providing analysis that's not spin. That's the thing that I think we need, and it's not only missing from U.S. international broadcasting now, you can argue that it's missing from media in general in this country, because I hear every single day, it's like, where can I just get the news, right? Now, any one of you can start a podcast tomorrow and call yourself a citizen journalist, and I encourage people who want to do that. The First Amendment is not reserved for journalists, right? It applies to everybody. And one other thing that I thought that U.S. international broadcasts could do was take the very best of all of these emerging influencers and use some of their programming to broadcast it to the rest of the world, as long as it was in line with our mission and followed our journalistic standards. And VOA did that very early on. It was using, I believe, programming that was supplied by NBC and CBS to some degree. We stopped doing that. I would go to a more expansive, a digital first model. And one other thing that I would note, I would go all over the world and I would go into bookstores, and on the shelf were these English learning, they were cassettes and then they were CDs or whatever, and it was material taken from the Voice of America. VOA had its own Learning English service too. I have found that to be one of the most underappreciated things that the VOA had. It was called a Special English originally. It started in 1959, I believe. And I would run into people all over the world who said, I learned English listening to the Voice of America. Okay? The difference with that learning English model was it was slowed down. I did some broadcasts sometimes for it, and you could not drink a lot of coffee before going on the air. So limited vocabulary, slow pace, because people would say, oh, CNN, whatever, could replace VOA. Well, the average person who's not a native English speaker might only pick up 30% of what's being said on CNN, and they wouldn't have all the context for it. So I would love to see, and I was working on this for a while, trying to find someone who would fund, a venture capitalist, a worldwide English language, slow speed audio streaming service that is just straight news. I think Americans would consume it as well. Maybe they needed it. It's limited vocabulary and slower pace. Yes.
My other question for you is, what can we citizens do to try to get back to bringing in the Voice of America again? Because I've seen petitions and things. Do they make a difference? Do they not make a difference? I just wanted to ask.
Well, at the end of that video we showed, it said, contact your member of Congress. Does it make a difference, Senator Durbin? Yes, he's nodding his head. So, the Congress controls the strings, the purse. The judiciary will decide whether what has happened to Voice of America was executive overreach or a permissible power of the president. We can't control that. Although one of the reasons I do a lot of public speaking, and my colleagues, former colleagues at VOA does too, is we do want judges to see what we think about it, and it's a kind of lobbying, for lack of a better word, that we're doing as individual citizens. That's, ultimately our fate is in the hands of the three different branches of government, because this is something that was federally funded. People said, oh, can't a billionaire finance something like this? Well, look at some of the billionaires who've gotten involved in media lately. Do we want them really financing something like this? And it costs a lot of money. The total budget of U.S. Agency for Global Media was running at $900 million. About around $900 million a year. So even the most generous philanthropist probably doesn't want to sink $1 billion a year into something like this.
Can I just add quickly that one of the special things about U.S. international broadcasting is that it has throughout its history enjoyed broad bipartisan support. When RFERL was on the chopping block, then president of RFERL, Tom Dine, I was working with, we would go up to the Hill, and the two stops we would always make were two senators who were working closely together to ensure the survival of RFERL, and those were Jesse Helms and Joe Biden. They may have had different reasons for why they were backing U.S. international broadcasting. I think Senator Helms saw it as a little bit more of a pointy stick in the eyes of the dictators. And Joe Biden probably saw a little more, and I'm greatly simplifying these things because they were sophisticated guys in their approach, but Biden saw it more as an extension of the traditional Kennedy-esque, we're going to spread American values and promote democracy. But it worked, and it worked for decades. It's broken down now because of the peculiar place one of our political parties is in. But I feel, and this gets back to reaching out to your individual members, don't think that just because you're represented by a Republican member of Congress that person's mind is going to be closed to supporting U.S. international broadcasting if the proper argument is made. It's a cheap date that makes a difference. It's not a big spend. It's a preemptive tool. You look at a country like Nigeria, where the president's talking about using hard power. This was one of the Voice of America's largest audiences in the Hausa language, Nigeria. Huge audiences. President Trump could be reaching the people of Nigeria across the spectrum every day with whatever message he wants to give to the people of Nigeria if he had the Voice of America's Hausa service there to do it. And he's chosen not to have that tool available. I just don't get it. So reach out to your members. Don't be afraid of where they are in the political spectrum. You can make the case, as Steve has done so eloquently here this evening.
Thank you, Jeff. I would just add that from when post-World War II, every U.S. president spoke directly to the people of the world through the Voice of America or gave an exclusive interview to VOA, except one. And you can guess who that was.